American pilots had an idea that remains iconic to this day, turning their obsolete fighters into flying sharks. One afternoon in December 1941, with a bucket of paint and a magazine photo, they created one of the most recognizable symbols in aviation history. Flight leader Robert R.T. Smith of the American Volunteer Group stood before his Curtiss P-40 fighter with a bucket of paint and a photograph from a magazine. The photograph showed a Royal Air Force fighter in North Africa with a distinctive shark mouth painted on its nose, jagged white teeth on a menacing grin beneath cold predator eyes. "The P-40's nose looks like a shark already. We just need to make it obvious." But the story of why they did it and what effect it had reveals something profound about psychological warfare, cultural symbolism, and the strange power of imagery in combat. What started as an afternoon art project by a handful of bored American pilots would become one of the most recognizable symbols in aviation history. The American Volunteer Group, better known as the Flying Tigers, was one of the most unusual military units in American history. Formed in 1941 before Pearl Harbor, the AVG consisted of American pilots who had resigned from the U.S. military to fight for China against Japan. Officially, they were civilians. In reality, they were a covert American military operation designed to support China while maintaining plausible deniability about U.S. involvement in the war. The commander, Claire Chennault, was a retired U.S. Army Air Corps captain who had been serving as an aviation advisor to Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese government. Chennault recruited experienced American military pilots with promises of high pay and adventure. The deal was straightforward. Resign your commission, travel to China as a civilian, and fight Japanese aircraft for $600 per month plus $500 bonus for every Japanese aircraft destroyed. By late 1941, approximately 100 American pilots and 200 ground crew had assembled in Burma and China, with 100 P-40B Tomahawk fighters supplied by the United States. They were training to defend the Burma Road, the vital supply line connecting Burma to China, when news of Pearl Harbor arrived on December 7, 1941. The pilots were young, aggressive, and far from home, fighting a war their country wasn't officially part of yet. Morale was a constant concern. The conditions in China were harsh: extreme heat, disease, poor food, isolation from home. The Japanese threat was overwhelming. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Force had hundreds of modern fighters and experienced pilots who had been fighting in China since 1937. The P-40S the AVG flew were cast-offs, aircraft that Britain had rejected as inadequate for combat in Europe. They lacked superchargers, limiting high-altitude performance. They were slower than Japanese fighters. They couldn't turn with the highly maneuverable A6M0. On paper, the AVG was outmatched and doomed. But Chennault understood something crucial about aerial combat that would inform every tactical decision, including the decision to paint shark mouths on his fighters. Combat isn't just about technical specifications, it's about psychology, tactics, and the effective use of whatever advantages you possess, and sometimes those advantages are completely unexpected. So why did Robert Smith decide to paint a shark mouth on his P-40? Stay with me. The origin story is more fascinating than you think. The direct inspiration for the Flying Tiger's shark mouth came from a photograph that appeared in an illustrated magazine, possibly Life or a similar publication, showing RAF fighters in North Africa with shark mouth nose art. The specific squadron was likely number 112 Squadron RAF, which had been painting shark mouths on their P-40 Tomahawks since mid-1941 while fighting in the Western Desert. But the concept of painting predatory mouths on aircraft was older than that. German pilots had painted shark mouths on some aircraft during World War I. The practice appeared sporadically in various air forces during the interwar period. What made the AVG's adoption unique was the scale. Nearly every operational P-40 in China received the shark mouth treatment, and the cultural context of fighting in Asia, where tiger and shark symbolism had specific meanings. Robert Smith saw the photograph and recognized immediately that the P-40's nose was perfectly shaped for a shark mouth. The large air intake scoop below the engine created a natural lower jaw. The long nose provided space for teeth. The overall proportions resembled a predatory fish. Smith was an artist before the war. He had worked as a commercial illustrator, and he understood visual impact. Eric Schilling, who photographed the process, later recalled, "RT sketched out the design freehand directly on the aircraft using chalk. He drew the teeth, the eyes, the overall shape. Then we painted it. The whole thing took about 3 hours. When we stepped back and looked at it, we knew immediately this was going to be on every aircraft in the group. It looked aggressive, menacing, perfect. The timing was significant. This occurred in late December 1941, just weeks after Pearl Harbor. The AVG pilots knew they would soon face combat. Morale was tense. The Sharkmouth provided something the pilots desperately needed: a psychological edge, a symbol of identity, something that made their outmatched fighters look dangerous rather than obsolete. Within days, ground crews were painting Sharkmouths on every operational P-40 in the AVG. Each was slightly different, some more elaborate, some simpler, some with more teeth, some with different eye designs. But the basic template was consistent: white teeth, red mouth interior, yellow outlined eyes, creating a snarling predator face on the nose of each fighter. But was it just decoration, or did it actually matter in combat? Hang on. We're about to see the first aerial battle and the psychological impact on both sides. The AVG's first combat mission came on December 20th, 1941, when Japanese bombers attacked Kunming. 16 P-40s of the AVG intercepted the raid, and for the first time, Japanese pilots encountered American fighters decorated with fierce sharkmouths rushing toward them at high speed. The tactical results were impressive. The AVG shot down several Japanese bombers with no losses, but the psychological impact proved equally significant. Japanese pilots reported being startled by the aggressive appearance of the American fighters. One captured Japanese pilot later stated that seeing the shark-mouthed fighters diving toward his formation created momentary confusion and fear. This psychological effect wasn't imaginary or superstitious. Combat pilots operate under extreme stress where split-second decisions determine life and death. Any factor that creates hesitation or confusion in an opponent provides tactical advantage. The shark-mouth didn't make the P-40 faster or more maneuverable, but it made it more psychologically imposing. Flight leader Greg "Pappy" Boyington, who later commanded the famous Black Sheep Squadron but started his career with the AVG, described the effect. "The Sharkmouth gave us an edge before the first shot was fired. Japanese pilots saw these snarling teeth coming at them, and it affected their decision-making. Not consciously, maybe, but combat psychology is largely subconscious. You see something that looks aggressive and predatory, your brain processes threat differently than if you see a plain aircraft." The Chinese civilian population responded even more dramatically to the shark-mouthed fighters. Chinese culture has deep symbolic associations with both tigers and sharks as powerful predators. When Chinese civilians saw American fighters with painted shark mouths defending their cities against Japanese bombers, the symbolism was immediately understood and embraced. Chinese media began referring to the American volunteer pilots as Fei Hu, flying tigers, associating them with the tiger, the most revered predator in Chinese culture. The sharkmouth had inadvertently triggered this association. The name Flying Tigers stuck, becoming the unit's permanent identity despite the aircraft being painted with shark mouths, not tiger faces. This cultural resonance proved invaluable for the AVG's operations in China. Chinese civilians and military personnel viewed the Flying Tigers as powerful protectors. The shark-tiger symbolism communicated aggression and capability in a culturally specific way that enhanced the AVG's reputation far beyond their actual numerical strength. But did the sharkmouth actually help win battles, or was it all psychological theater? Keep watching. We're about to examine the tactical doctrine that made these painted sharks legendary. The sharkmouth's effectiveness cannot be separated from Claire Chennault's tactical doctrine for the AVG. Chennault understood that his P-40s couldn't dogfight with Japanese fighters using conventional tactics. The Zero could outturn, outclimb, and outmaneuver the P-40 in almost every scenario. Traditional fighter combat, swirling dogfights emphasizing maneuverability, would get his pilots killed. Instead, Chennault developed tactics that exploited the P-40's actual advantages: diving speed, ruggedness, and heavy firepower. The doctrine was simple and strict: always maintain altitude advantage, dive on enemy aircraft at high speed, fire a concentrated burst, and extend away before the enemy could respond. Never turn with Japanese fighters, never engage in sustained maneuvering combat, hit hard, hit fast, disappear. This boom and zoom approach required discipline and patience. Pilots had to resist the natural aggressive impulse to chase damaged enemies or turn to engage pursuing fighters. Chennault drilled this doctrine relentlessly. Pilots who violated these tactics usually died. Pilots who followed them survived and achieved remarkable success. The shark mouth reinforced this tactical approach psychologically. The shark is an ambush predator. It strikes from below with explosive speed and overwhelming force, then disengages. This matched perfectly with Chennault's tactical doctrine. The painted shark wasn't just decoration, it was a visual representation of how the aircraft should be flown. Flight leader David Tex Hill described this psychological alignment. Every time I climbed into that cockpit and saw those teeth painted on my nose, it reminded me how to fight. I wasn't flying a nimble dogfighter. I was flying a shark. Sharks don't circle and maneuver with their prey. They strike from ambush with devastating force and withdraw. That's what Chennault taught us, and that's what the shark mouth symbolized. The tactical success of the AVG using these methods was extraordinary. Between December 1941 and July 1942, the Flying Tigers claimed 297 Japanese aircraft destroyed against 14 AVG pilots killed in action, a kill ratio exceeding 20-1. These numbers remain disputed. Japanese records suggest lower losses, but even conservative analysis confirms the AVG achieved disproportionate success against numerically superior forces. The shark-mouth became inseparable from this legend. Photographs of shark-mouthed P-40s appeared in American media throughout 1942, providing morale-boosting stories of American success against Japan during a period when most Pacific news was grim. The visual impact of those snarling teeth made the stories more memorable and dramatic. But the shark-mouth's influence extended far beyond the Flying Tigers. What happened next changed military aviation forever. Don't go anywhere. We're about to see how one paint job spread across the entire world. The success and publicity of the Flying Tigers' shark-mouthed P-40s inspired immediate imitation across multiple air forces and theaters. By mid-1942, American P-40 units in North Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific were painting shark mouths on their aircraft. The practice spread to other aircraft types: P-38s, P-39s, even heavy bombers received shark-mouth nose art. Allied forces embraced the symbol enthusiastically. RAF squadrons that had pioneered the shark mouth in North Africa expanded the practice. Australian P-40 squadrons in the Pacific adopted the design. Soviet pilots flying Lend-Lease P-40s in some units painted shark mouths on their aircraft, though less commonly than Western forces. The German Luftwaffe had their own tradition of nose art, and some units adopted shark mouths on their fighters, particularly in the Mediterranean theater. The shark mouth transcended national and ideological boundaries, becoming a universal symbol of fighter aggression. But why did this specific design proliferate so widely while other nose art remained unit-specific? The answer lies in the shark mouth's unique combination of psychological impact and practical simplicity. Unlike elaborate pin-up art or complex squadron insignia, the shark mouth was simple enough for any ground crew to paint freehand, yet dramatic enough to create immediate visual impact. Technical Sergeant John Fouth, who served with a P-40 unit in North Africa in 1942, explained the practical appeal. "We saw photographs of the Flying Tigers sharks and knew immediately we wanted that on our aircraft. The design was straightforward: teeth, eyes, gums. Any crew chief with a bucket of paint and a brush could do it in an afternoon. But the effect was dramatic. Our planes looked mean. That mattered to us psychologically, and it mattered to the enemy. The shark mouth also served practical purposes beyond psychology. The distinctive nose art made aircraft easier to identify quickly in combat. Pilots could recognize friendly aircraft at a glance by the characteristic shark grin. This aided formation keeping and prevented friendly fire incidents. Ground crews used the shark mouth as a reference point for maintenance. Check the teeth area for damage became shorthand for inspecting the nose section. The painted design created a memorable visual map of the aircraft's forward section. Most significantly, the shark mouth became a morale symbol that transcended individual units. A pilot shot down and rescued could look up and see shark-mouthed fighters overhead and know immediately that friendly forces were nearby, regardless of specific unit markings. The shark mouth became universal visual language for aggressive Allied fighter. But there was a darker side to this symbol. Stay tuned. We're about to explore the psychological warfare aspect that nobody talks about. The shark mouth was, at its core, a form of psychological warfare. Intimidation art designed to affect enemy morale and decision-making. This aspect of the symbol's effectiveness is rarely discussed, but was explicitly understood by the pilots and commanders who employed it. Psychological warfare through visual intimidation has deep historical roots. Ancient warriors painted frightening designs on shields and armor. Cavalry units attached tall plumes to helmets to appear larger and more imposing. Ships of the line were painted in striking colors to create psychological impact. The shark mouth was a modern application of an ancient principle. Make your weapon look more dangerous to gain psychological advantage. Claire Chenot understood this explicitly. In his post-war memoirs, he wrote, "The shark-mouth nose art served multiple purposes. It improved pilot morale by making our obsolete fighters look aggressive rather than outdated. It created unit identity and esprit de corps. But most importantly, it affected enemy psychology. Japanese pilots, seeing those teeth for the first time, experienced momentary shock that could delay their reaction by a critical second. In air combat, a second of hesitation can be fatal." Japanese documents captured after the war confirm this effect. An intelligence report from the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force's 64th Sentai noted, "American fighters in China display aggressive shark-mouth artwork that creates psychological impact on our pilots. This appears designed to compensate for their inferior aircraft performance through intimidation tactics. Pilots should be instructed to ignore decorative paint schemes and focus on tactical situation." The fact that Japanese command felt compelled to issue instructions to ignore the shark mouth demonstrates that it was having measurable psychological effect. You don't order pilots to ignore something unless that something is affecting performance. The psychological impact extended beyond Japanese pilots to Japanese civilians and military personnel on the ground. Seeing shark-mouthed fighters strafing Japanese positions created fear disproportionate to the actual damage inflicted. The visual signature of the shark mouth became associated with American air attacks, creating psychological anticipation and dread. But was this ethical? Did painting aggressive imagery on combat aircraft cross a line from legitimate military symbolism into psychological cruelty? These questions weren't seriously considered during the war, but they reflect larger issues about the nature of psychological warfare and its limits. The shark mouth walked a line between aggressive symbolism and genuine intimidation. Unlike propaganda that dehumanizes enemies or tactics that deliberately target civilian morale, the shark mouth was applied to military hardware engaged in legitimate combat operations. It made weapons of war look more dangerous, which is arguably the point of weapons. Yet the deliberate cultivation of fear, making your weapons appear more terrifying than functionally necessary, raises ethical questions that military historians continue to debate. Was the shark mouth just aggressive marketing, or was it a form of psychological attack that exploited fear for tactical advantage? The answer likely lies somewhere in between. The shark mouth was effective because it worked on multiple levels simultaneously: practical identification, unit morale, cultural symbolism, and yes, enemy intimidation. Separating these effects is impossible, which is probably why the practice spread so widely despite any ethical ambiguity. So what happened after the war? Did the shark mouth disappear, or does it still fly today? Hang in there, the modern legacy might surprise you. The shark mouth outlived World War II by decades, evolving from temporary paint scheme to permanent military aviation tradition. Post-war air forces continued painting shark mouths on fighters, particularly units with historical connections to World War II shark mouth squadrons. The United States Air Force maintained the tradition inconsistently through the Cold War. Some fighter squadrons adopted shark mouths as permanent unit insignia. The A-10 Thunderbolt II Warthog ground attack aircraft was particularly associated with shark mouth nose art. The aircraft's large forward fuselage and prominent gun made it ideal for the design, and many A-10 units painted elaborate shark mouths on their aircraft. During the Gulf War in 1991, numerous American fighters bore shark mouth nose art. F-16s, A-10s, and even some F-15s deployed to combat with painted teeth. The practice continued in Afghanistan and Iraq, though regulations became stricter about nose art in general, as military culture shifted toward more professional uniformity. Other nations maintained the tradition more consistently. The Republic of China Air Force, Taiwan, painted shark mouths on F-5 fighters as explicit homage to the flying tigers who had defended China during World War II. The practice connected modern Taiwanese pilots to the historical American volunteers who fought for Chinese independence. Some air forces rejected the shark mouth entirely. Soviet and later Russian air forces rarely employed elaborate nose art, preferring austere paint schemes that emphasized uniformity over individual expression. Chinese People's Liberation Army Air Force similarly avoided decorative nose art for most of its history, though some modern units have adopted less aggressive decorative schemes. The shark mouth became commercialized and romanticized in popular culture. Aviation museums worldwide display restored P-40s with flying tigers' shark mouth paint schemes. The symbol appears on flight jackets, patches, posters, and memorabilia. The original combat symbolism has been somewhat diluted by decades of commercial use, but the visual impact remains powerful. Modern military regulations regarding nose art vary by service and era. The U.S. Air Force currently allows limited nose art, including shark mouths, but requires approval and adherence to standards regarding imagery and messaging. The aggressive symbolism acceptable in World War II is sometimes considered inappropriate for modern military culture, emphasizing professionalism and cultural sensitivity. This tension between tradition and modern standards creates ongoing debates. Pilots with historical connections to shark mouth units argue for preserving the tradition. Critics argue that aggressive intimidation imagery is inconsistent with professional military culture and potentially offensive to international partners. The compromise in most modern air forces is allowing shark mouths and similar nose art for special occasions, air shows, commemorative events, anniversary celebrations, while maintaining more austere paint schemes for routine operations. This preserves the tradition while acknowledging changed cultural standards. But the fundamental question remains, did painting a shark mouth on a fighter actually matter, or was it all just decoration? Let me give you the final answer, and it's more complex than you think. The evidence suggests the shark mouth mattered, but not necessarily in the ways people assume. It didn't make aircraft faster or more maneuverable. It didn't improve weapon systems or tactical capabilities. But it affected human psychology on multiple levels, and since combat is ultimately conducted by humans, psychological factors matter enormously. For friendly pilots, the shark mouth improved morale and unit cohesion. Pilots felt more aggressive and capable flying aircraft that looked dangerous. Ground crews took pride in maintaining distinctive, visually impressive aircraft. The shark mouth created shared identity that strengthened unit effectiveness. For enemy pilots, the shark mouth created momentary psychological impact that could affect split-second decision-making in combat. The effect was small and temporary, but in air combat where victories are measured in seconds, small advantages compound into significant effects. For civilian populations, both friendly and enemy, the shark mouth created memorable visual symbolism that affected morale and propaganda value. The flying tiger sharks became powerful symbols of American resistance against Japan during dark early months of the Pacific War. The most profound effect may have been cultural and historical rather than immediate tactical. The shark mouth became one of the most recognizable symbols in military aviation history. It connected aviation across generations, with modern pilots looking back to World War II predecessors and seeing visual continuity in that distinctive painted grin. Perhaps that's the real answer to why American pilots drew shark faces on their planes. Not because it made them win battles directly, but because it made them feel like warriors, gave them identity, intimidated enemies just enough to matter, and created lasting symbols that would inspire future generations. In war, sometimes the psychological and symbolic victories matter as much as the tactical ones. The shark mouth that Robert Smith painted on his P-40 in December 1941 as a simple morale project became one of the enduring images of World War II aviation. Not through careful planning or strategic calculation, but through organic adoption by pilots who understood instinctively that looking dangerous is part of being dangerous. The teeth painted on obsolete fighters in China 70 years ago still fly today, carried forward by tradition and the simple recognition that some symbols capture something essential about human conflict that transcends rational analysis. If this story of psychology, symbolism, and the unexpected power of painted teeth captivated you, hit that subscribe button now for more untold stories from history's greatest battles. Don't miss out on the next revelation.